On October 21st, 1943, as the Second World War raged across continents, the quiet hum of an American military hospital in North Africa stood in stark contrast to the thunder of artillery on distant battlefields. Behind its whitewashed walls, rows of clean beds gleamed beneath fluorescent lights that never flickered, powered by steady generators. Here, the wounded arrived from the beaches of Sicily, from dogfights in the Mediterranean sky, and from the desert campaigns that had broken the back of Rommel's Afrika Korps. But on this particular day, the hospital was preparing for a different kind of arrival, a group of captured German nurses. Taken prisoner during the collapse of Axis positions in Tunisia, were escorted through its wide corridors. They had spent the war tending to the wounded in makeshift field hospitals, dark tents, crowded barns, rooms where antiseptic was scarce and morphine scarcer still. Their eyes carried both exhaustion and defiance, but as they stepped inside, what they saw left them speechless. Sterile operating theaters with gleaming steel instruments, endless rows of organized medical supplies, blood plasma stored in cooled units, ready to save a life within seconds. American doctors and nurses moved with brisk confidence, treating enemy soldiers with the same care as their own. For these women, raised under a regime that preached both superiority and suspicion, it was a stunning revelation. Here was medicine not as propaganda, but as progress. Clinical, efficient, and profoundly human. In that moment, amid the quiet beeping of monitors and the scent of disinfectant, the war faded just slightly. What remained was a lesson, etched not in bullets or bombs, but in bandages and healing hands. And for those German nurses, the world they thought they knew would never look the same again. They were led down long corridors, their footsteps echoing faintly against polished floors that smelled faintly of disinfectant and wax. The German nurses, mostly in their 20s, still wore the remnants of their uniforms, creased, dirt-stained, the white armbands frayed and smudged with dried blood. Some of them clutched their satchels as though holding on to the last fragments of familiarity, while others moved stiffly, heads held high, unwilling to reveal the storm of thoughts churning inside. They had braced themselves for humiliation, for cold stares or mocking words from their captors. Yet what greeted them was silence, professional, practiced silence, as American orderlies guided them deeper into the facility. For months they had lived in tents, pitched on barren soil, sand blowing through the cracks, water rationed, medicines dwindling, instruments sterilized only when there was fuel to burn. Operations were performed under lantern light, surgeons working with trembling hands, their scalpel blades sometimes dulled from overuse. They had seen men die not from their wounds, but from infection, from lack of morphine, from fevers that burned them away when no quinine could be found. These women had borne witness to desperation disguised as medicine. To them this was war. And then suddenly, as if stepping into a different century, they were here. The first thing that struck them was the lighting. Bright, unyielding, every corner illuminated without shadow. For a moment, some of the women squinted, shielding their eyes, disoriented by the unfamiliar glare. Fluorescent tubes hummed gently overhead, something most of them had never encountered. Back home in Germany, many hospitals still relied on tungsten bulbs and natural daylight, flickering, dim, easily interrupted by power shortages or raids. Here, even in wartime, the light did not falter. A nurse, her name recorded later as Liesel, muttered under her breath, "Es ist wie ein Theater." It is like a theater. But the stage here was not meant for performance. It was meant for saving lives. They passed open wards where American soldiers lay recovering. Some were pale and bandaged, others propped up with books, smiling faintly at visitors. Nurses in crisp white uniforms moved among them, checking vitals, adjusting IVs, administering doses with steady hands. The Germans could scarcely believe their eyes when they saw transparent tubes carrying fluid directly into veins, the flow carefully regulated by clamps and glass bottles suspended from metal stands. Intravenous therapy had existed in Germany too, but here it was routine, orderly, and plentiful. In their field hospitals, such equipment was a luxury, reserved only for the most critical cases, if it was available at all. One of the prisoners, a young Bavarian woman named Marta, slowed her pace, staring openly at the bottles lined in neat rows along a counter. She had once improvised IV solutions from boiled water and a pinch of salt, praying it would not kill rather than heal. Now before her stood shelves stocked with saline, glucose, and even plasma substitutes. She whispered to her companion, "Das ist unvorstellbar. They have enough for everyone." Her words carried no bitterness, only awe. When they were ushered into an operating theatre, the contrast became overwhelming. Stainless steel instruments glinted beneath the sterile lamps, each tool aligned with precision on trays. Nurses in masks and gloves stood at attention, prepared to assist. Surgeons in green gowns worked briskly, their movements confident and unhurried. At the center of the room, an American soldier lay anesthetized, his chest rising and falling gently under a white sheet as the team repaired a wound with quiet coordination. There was no shouting, no frantic scrambling for missing supplies. It was efficiency, pure and methodical. The German women exchanged glances. For years, Nazi propaganda had insisted that the Reich stood at the pinnacle of modernity, that its science, its medicine, its technology surpassed all others. Yet here in this hospital far from Berlin, they saw proof to the contrary. These were not crude improvisations in the desert. They were structured miracles of medicine, unfolding with a calmness that mocked the chaos they had endured. And the most disarming detail of all, the patient could have been anyone. American, British, even German. For these doctors, nationality did not seem to matter. A wound was a wound, and life was a life. Later that day, when the women were shown the blood bank, their composure faltered completely. Rows of bottles filled with deep crimson fluid rested inside cooled units, carefully labeled with blood types, ready for immediate transfusion. In German field hospitals, nurses often begged local civilians for blood donations, rushing samples back to camp with no means of storage. Many soldiers had died in their arms while waiting for transfusions that never came. Here, however, life-saving blood was catalogued, cooled and organized like precious treasure, though treated as routine. Liesel shook her head, whispering, "Das ist nicht Krieg. This is something else." For the Americans, such organization was not accidental. It was the product of an industrial machine that dwarfed anything Germany could muster. The Red Cross, in coordination with U.S. Army Medical Services, had perfected large-scale blood drives, transporting thousands of units across the Atlantic in refrigerated shipments. Factories back home mass-produced medical equipment, from scalpels to anesthetics, in quantities so vast that waste was hardly a concern. For the German nurses, trained in thrift, in making every bandage last, in stretching morphine across dozens of patients, this abundance felt surreal. That night, when they were escorted to their quarters, the silence weighed heavy. None of them spoke openly of what they had seen, but their thoughts lingered on the gleam of steel, the hum of lights, the quiet rhythm of order that seemed to pulse through every corridor. Some of them lay awake, staring into the darkness, their minds torn between loyalty to their homeland and the undeniable reality that the Reich's claims of superiority were illusions. They were nurses sworn to heal, and here, in the heart of their enemy's world, they had glimpsed what true healing could be, to receive. Each morning they were allowed under guard to walk the wards and observe. Officially, it was meant as an act of practicality. Their skills as trained medical workers could still be useful. Even in captivity, and with so many wounded pouring in from Sicily and Italy, extra hands were never unwelcome. But beneath that surface arrangement, something deeper was taking root. They were witnesses to a system that challenged everything they had been taught about power, about progress, and about humanity in war. They quickly noticed that discipline here did not mean fear. In German field hospitals, orders were barked, tempers flared, and disobedience could bring punishment severe enough to break a career or a spirit. Efficiency was demanded, but often at the cost of compassion. By contrast, in this American hospital, discipline was steady, but it was partnered with a kind of mutual respect. Nurses addressed doctors with formality, yes, but they also questioned them when clarity was needed and were not silenced for it. Orderlies were not treated as expendable hands, but as essential partners in keeping patients stable. It was a system where hierarchy existed, but functioned to serve the patient rather than the ego of those in power. For the German women, this was startling, even unsettling. They had never before seen medicine practiced without the shadow of intimidation. One afternoon, Marta was assigned to assist in changing dressings on a row of injured soldiers. She expected to be treated as a prisoner, watched closely, restricted to menial tasks. Instead, the supervising American nurse handed her clean gloves, instructed her in English she barely understood, and guided her step by step through the procedure. The American's tone was firm, but not cruel, and when Marta hesitated at a clamp, the nurse corrected her gently, as if teaching a colleague rather than addressing an enemy. Marta's cheeks flushed with a mix of shame and gratitude. She could not remember the last time anyone had treated her as more than just a function of the machine. Language barriers often created clumsy moments. Orders were repeated, gestures exaggerated, misunderstandings inevitable. Yet in the rhythm of care, a kind of universal speech emerged. The human body spoke its own language: blood pressure, pulse, the color of skin, the sound of labored breathing. These things required no translation. The German nurses found themselves slipping instinctively into the work, dressing wounds, carrying trays, wiping brows slick with fever. And each time they leaned over an American soldier, they braced for hatred, for an insult spat through clenched teeth. But it rarely came. Many of the wounded looked at them with weary curiosity, some with gratitude, others with indifference. A few even whispered "Danke," having picked up a word or two of German themselves. The front lines might have been oceans of enmity, but here in the sterile corridors, something quieter, almost merciful, was unfolding. Still, not all of them accepted it easily. At night, in the quarters where they slept on iron cots, whispers carried through the dark. Some muttered that this was propaganda, a performance meant to impress them, to undermine their loyalty. Others feared that back home, their families were being fed entirely different stories, that the Reich was describing American hospitals as chaotic, crude, under-equipped. What would happen if they admitted, even to themselves, that this was a lie? For women raised under a regime that punished doubt as treason, the inner conflict was suffocating, but the evidence grew too loud to ignore. They witnessed surgeries performed with penicillin, a miracle drug barely available in Europe, guarded like gold by German authorities who had failed to produce it in meaningful quantities. They saw burn victims recover at astonishing rates, thanks to careful skin grafts and antibiotic treatment. They saw soldiers who would have died within days in their own care walk again within weeks. The statistics were undeniable, the results visible. And perhaps most disturbing of all, they saw German prisoners treated alongside Americans. A young Luftwaffe pilot, his leg shattered in a crash, received the same level of care as the GI in the next bed. The German nurses stood frozen at the sight, unable to reconcile it with the indoctrination that painted Americans as ruthless, vindictive oppressors. Yet here he was, healing, smiling faintly as he sipped water, alive because of those he was taught to hate. Word of what they had seen spread among them, though guardedly. Liesl confided one evening that she could not stop thinking about the blood bank. It was like seeing the future, she whispered. Marta admitted that she had felt something like envy, watching the American nurses work with such resources at hand. They were not struggling against scarcity at every turn. They could focus on skill rather than survival. Even Anna, one of the most devoutly loyal to the Reich, confessed that she had never believed such abundance possible in wartime. "And if this is what they have here," she said quietly, "what must they have at home?" The question lingered in the silence, unspoken but heavy with implications. Outside, the war pressed on. Sicily had fallen. The Allies were advancing through Italy. Casualties mounted on all sides. Yet inside the hospital, the German women were undergoing a transformation no one could measure on a battlefield map. They were learning that their enemy's strength was not only in tanks or planes, but in the invisible arteries of industry and science that fed systems like this hospital. They began to realize that war was not only won by courage or loyalty, but by organization, planning, and an ability to harness knowledge for human survival. For some, this realization sparked admiration. For others, it ignited despair, because with every hallway they walked, with every procedure they witnessed, the truth became clearer. Germany could not compete with this. No matter what the propaganda claimed, no matter how many speeches Hitler delivered, the Reich had nothing to rival the scale and sophistication of America's medical machine. And if hospitals were this advanced, what did that say about factories, about shipyards, about airfields? The implications gnawed at them, whispering of inevitability. In moments when guards were not listening, some of the women began to dream aloud of what it might mean if such systems were someday shared. They imagined German villages where children no longer died of infections, where rural hospitals had shelves stocked like those they saw here, where blood could be given swiftly, antibiotics prescribed without hesitation. These were treasonous thoughts in the eyes of their homeland, but here in captivity the thoughts bloomed in secret. For the first time, many of them allowed themselves to believe that progress was not owned by nations, but belonged to humanity, waiting for whoever had the will to embrace it. Still, the tension between loyalty and revelation never entirely dissolved. Some of them hardened, clinging fiercely to their national pride, refusing to admit the depth of what they had seen. But even for them, the images remained, bright lights, steady hands, healing where there could have been vengeance. War would continue to rage, but inside their memories, the quiet hum of the American hospital would never be silenced. Winter came quietly to North Africa, but the war was anything but quiet. In December 1943, the Mediterranean roared with convoys, ferrying men and machines to the Italian front. The American hospital, though far from the sound of the guns, absorbed the tide of human wreckage daily. Stretcher after stretcher passed through its gates, each carrying a story of flesh and steel colliding in war's relentless grip. For the German nurses, captivity became less a matter of barbed wire and guards, and more a journey of the mind. They worked now as assistants, shadowing American staff, their movements purposeful yet haunted. Each day deepened their astonishment, and with it the fracture lines within their loyalty to the Reich. It was during one bitterly cold night that Martha found herself at the bedside of a dying American. His lungs had been torn by shrapnel. Each breath rattled like paper torn in half. An American doctor and nurse worked tirelessly, administering oxygen, transfusions, penicillin. Martha held the soldier's hand, feeling its warmth fade beneath her own. When at last his chest stilled, the nurse across from her placed a gentle hand on Martha's arm and whispered, "You did well." Martha nodded silently, but inside, the moment splintered her. In Germany, she had been taught to see Americans as the faceless enemy. But here, in that final breath, she had seen only a young man clinging to life, just as German boys had clung in her own care. Humanity, she realized, had no uniform. Days blurred together, filled with small revelations. The American hospital was not perfect. Mistakes happened. Patients still died. But the difference lay in the scale of possibility. A wound that spelled certain death in a German field hospital often became survivable here. The Germans began to recognize not just better tools, but a different philosophy. The Americans seemed driven by a conviction that every life was worth the fullest effort, no matter how grim the odds. To the Reich, medicine was often subordinated to ideology, to decisions of who deserved resources. To the Americans, at least within these walls, medicine stood apart. It was a sacred duty. Liesel, once the most skeptical, softened over time. One afternoon, she watched as American nurses gathered blood donors for an emergency transfusion. Dozens of soldiers lined up willingly, sleeves rolled, some joking nervously, others serious, but all willing to give. She had never seen such voluntary cooperation on this scale. Back home, donations had to be ordered, demanded, sometimes coerced. Here it was, given freely. When she later confided to Martha that it moved her, her voice trembled, as though ashamed of the admission. Yet the truth had pierced her defenses. She saw that medicine here was not only a science, but also a culture, woven into the fabric of how these people thought about community. At night, the nurses spoke of home, their voices low, uncertain if their words were safe. They thought of their mothers, of towns where hospitals lacked even soap some days. They thought of wounded soldiers who had begged for help they could not give, and how those memories haunted their dreams. Anna, still fiercely loyal, snapped once, "You are all forgetting who we are. We are Germans. This is an illusion. They want to break us." But even as she said it, her voice cracked, because deep down, even she could not erase the images of gleaming operating rooms and shelves stocked beyond. Imagination. The hospital also introduced them to something else they had rarely encountered. In their own system, compassion unbound by victory or loss. German POWs were treated without scorn. Wounded Italians, some former allies turned captives, lay beside American infantrymen. Once Martha witnessed a black American nurse tending to a white German prisoner. At first, she could not comprehend the sight. The Reich had taught her that such care would never be offered, that America was divided and broken. Yet here it was, unfolding in silence, the German prisoner's fevered brow wiped gently by a hand he might once have dismissed as inferior. The reality shook Marta to her core. It revealed a truth the Reich would never have admitted, that in this hospital, equality was practiced in a way her own country had never dared. Over weeks, the German women found themselves subtly transformed. They still wore the clothes of prisoners, still carried the weight of their homeland's collapse in Tunisia, but their minds had crossed a threshold. Each of them began to wonder in different ways what it would mean when the war ended. Would they return to Germany unchanged? Could they? Liesel imagined working in a rebuilt hospital one day, equipped with the machines she had seen here. Marta dreamed of studying more, of learning the methods the Americans used, of becoming part of something larger than national borders. Even Anna, though she never admitted it aloud, began to soften when she thought of the children she hoped to have someday. Wouldn't she want them treated in a place like this, rather than the broken wards of scarcity she had known? By the time 1944 dawned, the nurses had settled into routines, yet beneath their composure lived a quiet revolution of thought. Every time they sterilized instruments in gleaming autoclaves, every time they passed the humming refrigerators that preserved life in glass bottles, every time they watched surgeons working with antibiotics unavailable in Germany, they absorbed lessons their homeland had denied them. Lessons not only about science, but about humility, about how progress could shatter pride and leave in its place the fragile seed of hope. The war outside would grind on for nearly 2 more years, with unimaginable suffering ahead. The Reich would collapse in ruins, cities reduced to rubble, millions displaced, the world scarred. But for these women, the war's outcome had already been written in the wards of that American hospital. They had seen what their nation could never match, and in that knowledge they carried a private certainty of defeat. Yet paradoxically, they also carried a spark of possibility. For even as they mourned what Germany lacked, they cherished the idea that one day medicine might bridge the divides of hatred. Years later, historians would reflect on these encounters, on the ways prisoners of war experienced not only confinement, but revelation. For the German nurses of 1943, captivity had become a classroom. In the sterile corridors of their enemy, they had glimpsed a different future, one where healing outshone destruction, where progress was measured not in bombs, but in bandages. And though few records survive of their individual fates, the legacy of what they witnessed could not be undone. For once you have seen light, it is impossible to fully return to darkness. Visual. German POW nurses in simple uniform sitting on cots at night, deep in quiet conversation, faces lit by a single lamp, torn between loyalty and revelation. Visual. A symbolic shot of 1940s American hospital corridor glowing with bright light. Empty stretchers lined neatly, evoking both silence and possibility.